Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Deutschman, the Center's Executive Director, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to Speech Spotlight Live. Our Speech Spotlight Live program creates opportunities to dive deeply into specific topics, and today we are talking about the issue of the day, democracy. Although ballots have been cast and most of the results of the midterm elections are known, the conversation about how to foster democratic engagement on campus is far from over. Rather, I would argue that now is the precise moment we should be capitalizing on the energy from the midterms and translate it into institutionalizing programs that transcend voting and cultivate a healthier democracy. We are privileged to have four incredible experts on just this topic representing the UC Berkeley Vote Coalition, the Institute for Democracy in Higher Education, the American Association of Colleges and Universities, and the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab. We brought this group together initially for an Ask the Experts, which you will find in the chat, and their answers were so thoughtful and inspiring, I knew we had to give them a platform together. So here we are. Dawn, Brian, Alex, and Nancy, thank you so much for joining us. I anticipate that if we asked everyone in attendance today to write down their conception of civic engagement, we would find a significant variation among participants' definitions and descriptions. Civic engagement is certainly a buzzword du jour that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And with that in mind, I want to kick off today's conversation by asking each of our panelists to describe what civic engagement means to you and how it intersects with your day-to-day work. We're going to go ahead and start with Dawn Whitehead, who is the Vice President of the Office of Global Citizenship for Campus, Community, and Careers at the Association of American Colleges and Universities, otherwise known as AAC&U. Her work focuses on advancing practices and strategies to integrate global, civic, and experiential learning across curricular and co-curricular initiatives and practices that advance equitable participation in global and community-based learning for work, life, and citizenship. Dawn, I'm going to let you kick things off.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for inviting me to be a part of this panel. And I also want to thank you for the phrasing about describing civic engagement. At AAC&U, we work with a diverse group of colleges and universities, and we spend a lot of time looking at definitions. And when we talk about defining civic engagement, we find that it's more important to describe it so that it actually translates to the contextual fabric of an institution. So I'm happy that you phrase it this way. And one of the things I think about any of the definitions or descriptions is that it's important that it makes it clear that civic engagement is everybody's business. It doesn't belong to a single entity. So I would describe civic engagement from four areas or dimensions, if you will. One is knowledge and skills. So what is the foundational knowledge? What are those principles about community, and in the U.S. context in particular, democracy that students need to know that prepares them to be active members of society? And in this knowledge and skills section, we think about how students are able to develop knowledge, skills, and values to be active members of their societies. Secondly, I'd say it's grounded in community or communities, because we know there isn't one single community that encompasses everything. But when we're talking about civic engagement, we want students to think about how they themselves fit as individuals within society, to think about the personal and the public good, to think about the social and personal responsibilities that they may have, and to encourage them to examine their individual personal connections to the local, regional, national, and global communities in which they belong, and what their role is to improve their communities and make a difference. Thirdly, I would say when you think about civic engagement, it's interactive. And it involves students and individuals engaged in the practice of deliberation, of engagement across difference. So it requires skills, many would argue more than intercultural competence, but cultural humility, where you're wrestling with your own ways of thinking and interacting in every experience. And you never sort of get to that point where, oh, I've got this down pat. The other thing that I think when you think about this interactivity piece is there's a place for mutual care and mutual respect through engagement. And there has to be reflection, awareness, and reckoning of both the past and the present as we move forward. And then finally, I'd say the last dimension, when I think about civic engagement, is the action-oriented piece. It must be applied. And it's very important that we're able to help students make connections between what's written, what's read, what's heard in lectures, but also what's happening in the field, and how we can prepare students to work together to address common problems that they may have across difference by looking at the diverse perspectives that community members may have, folks on campus may have, and that collaborative problem solving is also a key. And then finally, I'd say it's continuous. And so I think those elements capture civic engagement from my perspective.
Thank you. That was beautiful. I love the concentric circles as we get wider to global, and I love cultural humility. We need more humility in the academy. All right, so next, kind of to build on that, I want to turn to Brian Hughes, who's an assistant professor in the program of Justice Law and Criminology at American University, as well as the co-founder and associate director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, PERIL, where he develops studies and interventions to reduce the risk of radicalization and extremism. You have a very unique perspective, Brian, and I'm so happy that you can share it with us.
Thanks very much, Michelle, and thanks to my co-panelists and to the audience too for coming out today to talk about what's really a critical topic. I think even more critical now that the midterms are over. As Michelle said, my lab looks at some of the nastiest things that stand in the way of democratic engagement and civic health. But actually what we've discovered over the years that we've been studying this and developing and testing interventions into it is that really the best way to address the worst elements of anti-democratic activity on our campuses is by strengthening the resilience of the broader campus community. And what we mean by that, we don't mean resilience in the sense of after a bad event has happened, how do you respond to it? How do you build back? How do you get the campus back on its feet, so to speak? Now, of course, that's inevitably going to happen from time to time. But what's really more important, we've discovered, is developing the kind of campus culture and the kind of higher education community where everyone feels as if they belong, as if their voice is heard, as if they can go about the daily business of living and learning and working on campus without having to worry about the threats of being targeted for hate or identity-based harassment or violence. And we've found that some of the best practices to avoid that have to do with being proactive. They have to do with establishing good classroom ground rules for having these discussions about all manner of topics. Because the fact is, in our polarized political climate, it isn't just the hot button issues that will generate points of controversy. It really can crop up just about anywhere. So equipping universities and colleges with the tools that staff at all levels need to proactively introduce these ideas and then guide and address them as things maybe get a little more dicey. Just to add to that as well, so it's important to foster these positive conversations, obviously, but it's just as critical to know where to draw the line, where the discussions can begin to cause harm and to actually negate those efforts towards building civic engagement and democratic responsibility. If these topics aren't handled delicately, if certain things are allowed to enter into the classroom, hate, misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories, what we find is that actually reduces the level of civic engagement and resilience within the communities, particularly among the individuals and the groups who have been minoritized or marginalized. So it's very important to deal with these issues before they come up, whether that's talking about how to have a constructive conversation or whether that's about equipping students and staff and faculty with the tools necessary to recognize manipulative or misleading or distracting forms of discourse.
Okay, great. Thank you. So Brian got a little bit ahead because he talked about his conception of civic engagement and that's okay, and started with some of the to-dos. But so for Alex and Nancy, I'm going to ask you just to continue to talk about your conception, and then we'll go on to that. We can't have a discussion about this kind of issue without having a student voice. And we don't just have any student voice. We have the voice of the director of the association students of the University of California Vote Coalition, Alex Edgar. Alex is a second year at Berkeley, go Bears, and he's committed to making the democratic process accessible to all students, especially within historically marginalized and underrepresented communities. He's passionate about making voting a priority for students and empowering them to become further involved with the civic process. And I'm proud to share that Alex is a Center Voice awardee, and he's currently our stellar center intern. Alex, I'd love for you to share with us your kind of conception of civic engagement.
Definitely. Well, thank you again so much for having me. And thank you to all my fellow panelists for being so incredible. I know I've, read a lot of your work, and especially Nancy with Circle. I've seen a lot of the research, and a little bit of minor, little celebrity to me in my civic engagement world. So it's really great being here. But really, when I think about, civic engagement from my perspective, I, try to break it down into the 3 C's. And those 3 C's are community, change, and courage. And I think when first approaching community, I think it's really important that civic engagement is based on an individual's interactions in their community, whether that is, community in, their city and their school, in any of the broader groups they're in. It could be a church or even an organization that, spans all of those. And I think the ways individuals kind of interact with each other, especially when related to our governance and to kind of what we would call civic engagement, is really important. And I think that's what brings into the next part, change, because I think, you can't have civic engagement without that end goal. That end goal is change. And regardless of what change that person wants to see in the world, I think it is essential to see that anyone who's civically engaged is working towards their end goal. And I think by really empowering people to discover what those issues are, what those changes they want to see in the world are, is a really powerful way to get people civically engaged. And then connecting to the last point, courage. I think courage is something that we don't talk about a lot when it comes to civic engagement. We say it's a civic duty to vote. But I think duty really kind of undersells how important this is, but also how much people have had to fight to get to this place, to be able to vote from marginalized communities, and also young people. I mean, it's taken for granted when there were super long poll lines in this last election. People are saying, great, young people were turning out to vote in high numbers. I'm saying, well, they're being really courageous to get out there and vote, but why is the system not working to allow them easy access? So I think civic engagement kind of represents those 3 terms.
I love that. And I'm already feeling inspired. And so we're going to get to our final panelist, last but certainly not least, Nancy Thomas. Nancy directs IDHE, the nation's leading applied research center on student political learning and participation in democracy. While IDHE is the home to NSOLVE, which is a large study of student voting, IDHE studies also campus climates for political learning and equitable engagement in democracy, political discussion in and beyond the classroom, free speech and inclusion on campuses. Nancy has long advocated for more robust attention by colleges and universities to democracy's health and future. I have to add that Nancy is a mentor of mine, one of the first kind of friends of the center, and is now a member of our National Advisory Board. So it's a real privilege to get to have you be part of Speech Spotlight Live. And let's hear your conception, and then we'll get to, how we fix it all.
Okay. Thank you, Michelle. Thanks for this invitation. I'm very proud to be on your board and really proud to be with this panel. Amazing group. So I'm going to just go back to sort of the basics and talk about what civic engagement is. And the thing I want to stress is that it's got a couple of attributes to it. One is it is active. It's action. And so civic engagement can take many forms. You could be in the military. You could choose a public service career. You could do some good work with your neighbor. You could run for office or write a letter to your representative or your local newspaper. You can vote. But all of that needs to be viewed as a means to another end. And we always talk about that end as being a stronger, more robust, equitable, and just and inclusive democracy. So while civic engagement is tremendously important, and it is how we all manifest our commitment to each other, to our communities, and to the nation, I think it's also critical to have the right commitment in your heart, to be thinking about my engagement in this society as a way to make it work better. And I think a lot of us can agree that democracy isn't working the way we all want it to. And so I'm always talking about not the democracy we have, but the one we want. And so I encourage people to think of civic engagement as action. I encourage people to think of that action broadly. And I think of it as something that is communal and that your heart is going in the right direction, which is you want a democracy that works for everybody and that is inclusive, equitable, and just.
All right. Commitment, change, community, courage, continuous. A lot of C words and a lot of things to embody. And if I'm going to be honest, when I first started at the center, I think I had a very limited conception of what civic engagement has been or was, and it's really been broadened over time. And there's something so heartening about that you can find something in civic engagement for everyone, and that we want there to be a way for everyone to connect to it. So, democracy and some of the challenges that our democracy has faced is something that I think many people, and certainly all of you, have been thinking about. And certainly, the center focuses on higher education, which I believe is just a microcosm of greater society. And we've been thinking more and more about the connection between higher education and democracy. And I guess one of the questions I have for you is, what do we think higher education owes democracy, right? That as the home to future leaders and current leaders, what role should campuses be playing in institutionalizing this kind of civic engagement conception? And Alex, I'm going to let you start.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate this question, since so much of the work I do on campus as the student lead of everything related to voting, this very much plays into a lot of my work. But yeah, I really think that students go to college, they're fresh new voters, or maybe they by some chance have voted beforehand. But majority of college students are new voters or second-time voters. And when you're in that space, you really need a lot of guidance. And I think that because of our kind of system of civic education in our K through 12 curriculum, a lot of students enter college grossly underprepared to understand a lot of what they're being asked to do as, citizens, as voters. And when they're everything from how to fill out a ballot to what are these positions that they're voting for is all stuff that most students don't know unless some family member is a previous voter or some other mentor of theirs explain them, kind of walk them through it. So I think higher education really owes students the ability to kind of guide them through the democratic process and through civic engagement, and to not be an obstacle. Because I think higher education so often is an obstacle to civic engagement. I know I have class on election day. Most students have class on election day. And even in states where they're not as lucky as in California to have universal mail-in voting, places where there are, polling locations that there are hour-long lines. I know at Berkeley, there was a 2-hour-long line just to vote for a single polling location that our student government actually paid for out of pocket, not the campus itself. So I think it kind of draws this larger problem of higher education being a roadblock rather than kind of the uplifter of students as they're trying to be democratically engaged. So I think going into the future, there's definitely a lot of room for improvement of higher education to really be that kind of growing place where students can feel comfortable to ask questions and to really get engaged in the community so that they can be better, more informed voters in the future.
Thank you so much, Alex. Guidance and resources. And Alex had shared with me that about the polling place. It's quite expensive to have a polling place. So it's great that you guys could raise the money to do that. Nancy, talk to us about what campuses should be doing. What is their role?
Yeah, it's a big question, isn't it? So what does higher education owe democracy? So I think first and foremost, the idea behind the symbiotic relationship between democracy and education is that education will provide democracy with informed, active, compassionate, knowledgeable, etc. People who will serve as agents and stewards of a healthier democracy. So that's one way to look at it, is that you need an informed and active and principled populace in order to have a strong democracy. But there's another side to that, and that has to do with this age-old idea that democracy is remade in every generation, and that education is its so-called, or higher education is its so-called midwife. Think about that rule, because it's a pretty old one, and it's something that John Dewey said in the early 1900s, and it's often quoted. But remember who got to go to college then, and how democracy was recreated generation after generation based on systems in higher education that were exclusionary, discriminatory, and did not provide the kind of social, economic, and political mobility to populations that needed it the most. And so, in addition to being informed people, graduates of colleges and universities need to acknowledge democracy's failures and then figure out what the responsibilities are to talk about it and reinvent it. And I would be remiss here if I didn't give a shout out to my team of people who've been working on this issue for over a year now. And they consist of really good scholars over at Loyola University's Ed School, Dimitri Morgan, Norma Lopez, and Tori Calais, and then also people in my office, and particularly Adam Gismondi, who's having a baby, I hope soon, and Margaret Brower, who, for those of you who have been following our work, see her name everywhere. So this collaborative process that we have gone through, where we've tried really hard to identify some language that would give higher education some direction, does include this idea of higher ed being contested and reinvented. And then finally, I just wanted to say one more thing, and that is we define democracy not just as a system of government. We define it as a culture, a way that people interact and get along and work together to solve public problems. And so if you think of democracy as a culture, it is a slightly different task than if you're just fixing the mechanics. And so I think higher education's role is to educate people to fix the mechanics and to do it through an equity lens, but also to be thinking about what does it take to make a strong democracy a culture of people who will work together toward inclusion, equity, justice, and a robust set of systems, institutions, but communities.
Thank you. I love that. I love that there's an aspirational nature to what we're talking about today. Before I turn to Brian, I just want to remind our attendees that you should feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A. We want to be able to hear from you, and not just questions, but also any comments or things that have worked well for you at your university. This is a place to begin to share resources. So Brian, really approach the threats to democracy from a different vantage point. And so I'm curious, from the lens that you look at through things, what do you think higher ed needs to be doing?
Well, I think that there are two things from our point of view that higher ed could be doing. And one is to protect itself from attacks by anti-democratic forces and extremist elements in our society. And then the other is to protect students and prepare students for the reality that there are those anti-democratic and extremist elements in our society. We see attacks on professors. We see attacks on the very idea that higher education is there to expand expand students' worldviews, to introduce them to new people, a diverse new community, to broaden their horizons. This is presented as an existential threat by extremist groups, and one that is often met with violence. I think that colleges and universities need to be very aware of that fact, and they need to stand strong, and they can't capitulate to bad actors or the threat of violence. There is an awful lot of special pleading and bad faith attacks that come under the guise of appeals to free speech, which in fact are not real appeals to free speech, because they in effect silence the voices of marginalized and minoritized groups and individuals on campus. So higher ed has a responsibility to protect itself, because by protecting itself, it actually protects its students. And what goes along with that is that we can incorporate this kind of education and this kind of preparation into our curricula and into our lessons and into our student life, preparing students with the knowledge and the tools that they need to recognize the ways that extremism, moral disengagement, conspiracy theories can interject themselves into our lives and into our media, often through very insidious and subtle means. This is something that we really ought to be teaching across all disciplines, because it's an issue that affects all disciplines, from the natural sciences through the humanities, the social sciences, the arts, you name it. So inoculating students by training them to recognize and resist this kind of manipulation. I think that's how universities can prepare the next generation to carry on and expand and enrich and realize the democratic ideals that we're striving for.
Thank you. Now I have a list of R words: recognize, resist, realize, but no pressure, Dawn, to go with the R's. Okay. From your vantage point, kind of a more global vantage point, Dawn, what do you think higher ed owes democracy, and how are they going to make it happen?
Yeah, well, in full disclosure, AAC&U's mission is to advance the democratic purposes of higher education through the promotion of equity, innovation, and excellence in liberal education. So organizationally and personally, I come to this believing that higher education should play a pivotal role in preparing students for democratic preparation. There was an article a couple of years ago in The Atlantic by Yoni Applebaum, and it was written, "Democracy is an acquired habit. And like most habits, democratic behavior develops slowly over time through constant repetition." And from our perspective, institutions of higher education are one of many places where this repetition should occur. And of course, democratic participation is a part of civic engagement. And, from our perspective, you'll hear a little bit of an echo of Brian's comments, but we should be encouraging and emphasizing the institutionalization of civic engagement across campus. So that would mean that all faculty, staff, and students would understand the civic roles they can and should play. It would mean also, as Brian touched on, students have multiple opportunities to develop and hone their civic skills, both on and off campus. And so I think we've seen institutions that have been able to embed civic learning across the curriculum. So as Brian said, in all majors, in anthropology, in business, in education, engineering, that we've seen success because they've been able to look at those broad learning outcomes that include civic learning, that's a part of almost all of our mission statements. And they found a way to embed this into the curriculum, into the course experiences, and into the co-curricular experiences. And that, of course, helps students see, oh, civic learning isn't just part of my introductory political science course. It's actually part of what I'm developing. As I'm developing into this young professional, civic learning is a part of that, and I will be a civic-minded professional, if you will. In a 2012 AAC&U publication, we made the case to move from partial civic learning to pervasive civic learning. And so I think that is the key, and the best role higher education can play is to embed this across the curricular and co-curricular so students see it everywhere.
And while we're on that, moving from partial to pervasive, and I'm going to open this up to anybody who wants to give any specific examples of universities or organizations that you think are doing this well, that you might want to share with our group today, or things that you would suggest that people, if they're just, I can see how all of a sudden trying to have pervasive civic engagement can feel overwhelming. And so how does maybe a university or a college that isn't as far along in their trajectory, what do they think of as they start to think about how to begin this process? Who wants to start?
I'll say one thing very quickly. I think, and this isn't going to be an institution, but this is going to be a state that people may want to look to. So the state of Massachusetts was the first state in the nation to make civic learning a goal for all undergraduates in public education. So I think you can look at what's being done at some of the institutions in Massachusetts as a model. I know University of Nebraska, Lincoln, I've seen a couple of examples of a credential program there where students from all majors, computer science students working with nonprofits to help them develop a web-based tool to deal with matching so that they could do mentor matches. So again, it was a need that was identified by the nonprofit, and then the institution came alongside and did that work. Again, the students are working in their professional space. It's not as if students are going in, and there's nothing wrong with doing this, but it's not that students are going in and, doing a cleanup project or doing a mural, which all of those are valid as well. But it's also important that we have students doing this work in their careers, in their profession. So it helps them see where you will, how you can continue doing this as a professional. So those are a couple of examples that I would share.
Right. It's not just something extra that you do. It's incorporated into not just your discipline, but into your work. Anyone else want to add to that before I turn to an audience question? Nancy, go ahead.
So first of all, I really appreciate what Dawn just said. And I also just want a true confession here. And that is that I don't think I could do this work without AAC&U. I mean, they play this role of conveners. They give us language. They give us ideas. They give us opportunities. And for anybody who really wants to get into this work, I recommend attending one of the conferences. We have done what we call campus climate studies. We've looked at politically engaged campuses and campuses that are really making an effort toward what Dawn just said, which is this idea of pervasiveness. And I'm going to confess, I think there isn't a lot of pervasiveness in higher education. What I think there are lots of pockets of brilliance, such as Peril, or such as student leadership that really takes hold, like the leadership that Alex is providing. So in some ways, it's happening everywhere. It just needs to be shared. And I always want to, I want to start a replication program. I just want to say, okay, how do we get Peril on every campus? How do we get leadership opportunities like Alex had on every campus? And we have dozens of examples. I will give one. We visited a campus that is crazy engaged. And the students are all on, they're all connected. It's a big commuter campus. It's not a small bucolic liberal arts college. Everybody says to me, oh, you did this research at small resource universities. No, not the case. And in this place, they have what's called a Center for Public Deliberation, which is a project that is literally run by one woman who goes into the community, the local community, and talks about some of the community's distresses and works with students and trains students to be the facilitators of those conversations about public problem solving. The students then go back to campus and expect that kind of dialogic exchange in their classroom. They also are crazy influential among their peers. And so when we did focus groups with what we called student leaders, we found they all showed up in suits. And I said, "Oh, you didn't have to dress up for me." And they said, "We didn't dress up for you." I said, "Why are you dressed up?" And they said, "Well, you just never know when there's going to be a photo op." I said, "A photo op?" And they said, yeah. So Nelson Mandela was dying, and we decided to hold a candlelight vigil. We got 400 candles. We texted everybody and said, "Come to this common space." The students all showed up. Half of us from the student government are on the phone calling the media saying, "Come to campus. There will be politicians here, and you can take pictures of them being part of a vigil for Nelson Mandela." And the other group was on the phone to the politicians saying, "Come to campus. There will be a photo op." These students knew how to make change, how to embed this across the curriculum. They were the drivers. Yes, there were some other very big supportive structures on campus that enabled this. But the other thing these students did, just FYI, is they also controlled student fees. And they did not give any student fees to clubs that did not train their leaders in the arts of collaborative leadership and discussion. So this is an example of something that can permeate a culture of a campus and really transform it. And there were more things like faculty development, but that's an idea. That's an example.
I want to follow up on just a couple of things that Nancy said. First of all, I appreciate your confession that maybe there's not that many examples of pervasiveness, because I think that must be it's a relief to me, because I feel like I do this work and I'm not sure where I can point my finger. So it must be a relief to the people who are trying to do this work, right? That really the place to start is maybe with one pocket, like you said, of brilliance, right? And to go from there and to have some specific examples. While I don't know, I'm going to take a break from this question, if that's okay, and pose one that came from our audience that I think is really interesting, and I want to share it if I can. Oh, here it is. So to view it, and I think it meaning democracy from or democratic engagement from a cultural and equity lens, how is this done without marginalizing others or their viewpoints? And I'll open it up to either Brian or Alex first, or if you want to take a pass, it can go to John or Nancy.
No, I'd love to answer this because actually the two examples that I was thinking of as we were discussing this last question, I think address this. On one end of things, there are views that need to be marginalized, views that espouse violence against people within our community based on their core immutable identity characteristics, or based on politics. The call for political violence and this process of moral disengagement that says that my political opponents are not worthy of moral consideration, anything goes in order to suppress them. Those views do need to be marginalized, and something that we've seen yield very positive results is what's called attitudinal inoculation. This is kind of a hybrid of media literacy and counter-propaganda education, where simply all you do is you present students or whomever with the red flags for spotting manipulative rhetoric and narratives. And there are decades of research that show that if you present these red flags and you explain how they work and how they're manipulative, it gives people the tools to recognize this and actually recognize a variety of manipulative rhetorics and narratives. So what this does is this just empowers the people in our communities, our campus communities in this case, to spot when bad actors are trying to move them in a direction that isn't in their best interest. Now, it's ideologically neutral. Really, this is not about trying to turn conservatives into progressives or try to convert someone from one religion to another or to no religion. It really is just equipping people with the skills to recognize bad faith arguments. And because the arguments in favor of moral disengagement and hate-based extremism are invalid, it's able to sequester those absolute worst elements off from the public discussion. Now, the inoculation analogy is actually quite apt because it doesn't work in 100% of the cases. But when it's applied to an entire campus community, it confers high enough benefits across the board that these problems are significantly reduced. So now that's one end of things. But then I want to say something positive and something that really gives me inspiration and hope. There is a group in Mississippi called the Freedom Schools. Now they take the name from the historical Freedom Schools, although this is its own separate organization. And what they do is they go into badly underserved, marginalized, poor Black communities, and they provide community focused and community guided education into the history, local history, national history, global history. They cultivate activity and mutual support within the community that draws on the strengths of the students. Now, this isn't something that we should, this is something that we should be taking inspiration from and applying on a much larger scale. You know, here at American University, here in Washington, D.C., there are significant examples of local history that we ought to be teaching and we ought to be leveraging as a way of understanding how the United States has not always lived up to the promises of democracy, while at the same time enlisting students and staff and faculty in this ongoing project and this ongoing mission of not repeating those mistakes and achieving our country, achieving the democracy that we believe in.
Thank you. Thanks and I'm going to open up to Alex. I don't know if you want to respond either to the original question or to this audience question. We can just sort of open it up for conversation amongst the four of you and see what happens.
Definitely, yeah. And I think this is a really important question. So I'm really thankful to whoever asked it. And especially coming from UC Berkeley, which is the home of the free speech movement, and also from California, where we have Prop 209 still in place and have been dealing with the effects of the banning of affirmative action on, admissions to the UC system, the CSU system, in our California community colleges. And I think it's really important to kind of look at kind of our own attitudes as we're approaching this, because especially at, more progressive spaces that I tend to be in, because Berkeley, California, it tends to be the kind of the cultural norm of progressivism versus everything else. I know I recently hosted a Prop 1 rally at Berkeley for abortion rights, and there were counter protesters. And they obviously have every right, as much as we do, to be there, sharing their beliefs. And the school administrator came up to me, complaining about how there was nothing that they could do to get the kind of protesters to protest elsewhere. And I thought, the fact that a school administrator, someone who holds a bit more power than I do in this situation, was so willing to verbalize that he wishes that that they could change the fact that there are kind of protesters, really showed to me that I think that there is a need to change the overall kind of, not just at Berkeley but nationally, the perception of how we have civil dialogue. Because I think it's a really lost art among a lot of people. We're very used to, finding our support systems, whether it's online or in our in-person communities, that I think in order to really uplift marginalized communities, but also, people from differing opinions, to really, uplift their ability to exist and allow them, the same space that we'd want others to grant us. We really need to work on giving each other a lot of compassion and allowing, civil disagreement, because, you don't have to like someone, but you should respect their right to express their opinion. And I think, going back to all of the affirmative action Supreme Court cases going on, I know Representative Barbara Lee, who's our representative up at Berkeley, always talks every time she comes to Berkeley about how little African-American students there are at UC Berkeley, despite the high percentage in the community around it. And it's really, troubling when you have higher education institutions that don't represent the community, the state that they are serving. And I think, as we've discussed before, higher education has a direct line into civic engagement, direct line into our democracy. So I think by allowing, as many people from marginalized groups to have access into the system to really learn and be engaged in this democratic process, and also helping people understand, how to better allow opinions that you disagree with to be voiced. And, I think, Dean Erwin Chemerinsky, always talks about you kind of fight hate speech by letting it get out there. And once it's out there, you can say kind of how silly it is. So I think by having those kind of two approaches, it's a good way to, both uplift, but also allow everyone to have their voice.
Well said. I think going back to what Dawn said about the article by Yoni Applebaum, democracy is an acquired habit. Well, guess what? So is discussion across difference. It's not something you just wake up and know how to do, right? And I think we spend a lot of time, right, in college teaching folks, the essay and languages and mathematical equations and applied statistics. But we just sort of expect that people are going to figure out how it is that you're supposed to talk with someone compassionately and, civilly without those tools. All right, I'm going to open it up. Dawn, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add.
I think one thing I would just add, and this is kind of taking us back to a curricular connection and also the models. One other place I would look at, and it doesn't shout civic engagement, but I think if you look at some of the work that's coming out of WPI, Worcester Polytechnic Institute, where the institution is centered on project-based learning. So all of the students there are having to work in teams, which is good preparation for civic engagement. And they've developed a number of strong resources for an asset-based model to working together as a team. So I'm thinking of the question that was posed, how do you do this from a perspective that doesn't marginalize thoughts, ideas? When you use sort of an asset-based model of teams, what are you bringing to this? What do you want to learn in this engagement? What are some of your challenges? And where you can openly talk about some of those things before you even get into doing the work, that also helps to, again, I would say, build our muscles, toward democratic engagement and working across different. So I think that's just one model that we may not think directly relates to civic engagement, but ultimately it does help develop those skills.
Thanks. Nancy, anything or anyone want to add anything else before I kind of go to our kind of one of our final questions as we get close to 1:00, sadly?
I just have one other comment, and that is that like Brian, I think we need to draw some lines. And I also think that's why we have academic freedom. We have the academic freedom to teach about the democracy we want, not the one we have. And I get stuck on the free speech and inclusion debate when I hear people say all opinions are valued, and yet the opinions that are valued are dehumanizing. And if you've got dehumanizing positions on your campus, I don't think you're creating an equitable learning environment. So what we always recommend is, I got an idea. How about we talk about that tension? And let's talk about what kind of learning community we want to create as a group, and set a bunch of cultural norms around issues of inclusion and attitudes and behaviors and norms and priorities that then get revisited periodically. But I think it's when people feel that they're being dehumanized and their power is stripped of them. And if I see one more president write an email to a community that says, "Oh, we abhor that horrible event that just took place. We're providing a counseling center over here and a place that you can come over there," that just feels incomplete to me. So I would like to see colleges and universities get a little more courageous about at least discussing the lines and coming together as a community about them. We have a free speech and inclusion guide on our campus. And I can tell you, I've never seen a guide where everybody, a conversation where everybody comes out on one end saying, "We're going to shut them all down." That's not how these conversations end. And so I think it's important to build a process so that we can know how to collectively draw lines.
Absolutely. And then to understand and think about what makes something an opinion that is valuable in the intellectual or educational community, right? As I would make the argument that Twitter or other social media is not quite the same environment as a university. We have a question from Farrell Ackerman at UCSD. And I think, Farrell, the answer is going to be yes, but I'll read it. It says, "Even though we're focusing on higher ed, wouldn't it make the efforts in higher ed less onerous if guidance about identifying biased or invalid arguments was a major focus in high schools and lower schools? The increasing burdens on higher education comes harder and harder to address across disciplines where these issues are not central without earlier training." And I'm sure the answer is everyone agrees. And I don't know if anyone wants to reference whether we think that that's something that's improving. I mean, I'm a big believer that this is all a continuum. And that, of course, the early intervention, like with anything with kids, early intervention and education, I think is better for all the things we're talking about. But I think Farrell wants to know how do we do it? How do we help, maybe persuade high schools and lower schools that this is essential?
I can offer maybe just some support for why this is such an important question. In the field of extremism and terrorism studies, we see that the age of radicalization is getting both older and younger. You have now people as young as 13 who are leading violent extremist groups. I mean, really violent extremist groups. And so this absolutely needs to be addressed before students reach college or university. Now, in the United States, that's more difficult than in other countries because of the way that our middle schools and elementary schools are governed, of course.
And if, were you gonna? Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say that could be the topic of a whole other webinar. How our secondary schools are governed. No, go ahead, Ton.
Right. So I'll just say a tiny quick thing is I think we're seeing some connection with the collaboration in K-12 and higher ed with schools of education, colleges of education that are very mindful about which school systems are going to work with. Do they, are they going to be a school district that's going to be open to these types of things? Is it divisive? Are they having those issues? And then I think the other part is with the transfer. We're seeing some institutions where students are able to get early credit and transfer into community colleges. We're seeing a closer connection. And so I think that's a place where we might be able to see some growth. But I think more and more institutions of higher ed are trying to partner. So I completely agree that we need to do more. And I've seen it in, like I said, those colleges of education partnerships have been a place that's been positive for some of that development.
That's great. We only have 5 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to really quickly share any last minute thoughts or ideas that you haven't had a chance to share. It'll be like a lightning round, and we will start with Alex.
Okay, very quickly, most important thing I'd say when it comes to nurturing democracy on campus is centering students, student voices, student leadership. and really giving students the ability to use their own agency to make change on campus. No project, no institute that you form is going to be able to run and is going to be able to make an impact without that centering of student voices. And as a student who's been at many tables where, I'm sitting in the back while all of the leaders are discussing how young people should be getting involved, I just want to say, let young people have that seat at the table, and they will take advantage of it. And you will be very, very thankful for the work that they do.
Okay, Nancy.
So I think there's something to be said about listening and the importance of listening for understanding and for empathy. And I know from personal experience that this isn't always easy to do. We come at things with our own set of beliefs and history of successes based on our very firm, this is what I've always done. And I think that higher education needs to hold up a mirror right now and say, this may be what we've always done, but is it always the right thing? And I think one really big, tough problem to work on is the institutions that are under-resourced and trying to provide equitable learning opportunities to students who are marginalized, poor, of color, and in traumatized communities right now. So I think there's a lot to be done to sort of say, just because we've always done it this way may not be the right way to do it.
I agree. It's kind of the equivalent of just because you have the right to say something doesn't mean you should say it. I mean, kind of rights and responsibilities when we're talking about expression. Okay, Brian.
Well, I think Alex and Nancy have already put it really wonderfully, that there's no simple 2 or 3 step protocol that you can put into place to answer these questions. It's really a very nuanced and subtle and socially fraught sometimes dialogue that needs to take place between everyone within a community. And I think that the most important thing about holding that dialogue is to begin by asking the community itself what its needs are, how it thinks the best way to achieve those needs, what it thinks the best way to achieve those needs is, not to come at it in a top-down way, but really to listen and allow the community to lead. And in particular, to ask the voices within that community who are the most likely not to have been heard or not to be heard today, to start with them and then to build out from there.
So much emphasis on listening. Okay, Dawn, you have the final word.
Yeah, I think the last thing, I agree with everything that's been said, is I think that we are seeing that threats to democracy come when people have less opportunities to participate in democracy. And so I think as folks in higher education, the more opportunities we have for students, faculty, and staff to participate in democratic organizations, democratic spaces, that simply puts us in a better position to nurture democracy.
Yeah, that's a very interesting correlation. I never thought of it that way. Listen, I want to thank all of you. We could have had a one-on-one with each of you for an hour and probably still had more to say. So I want to thank you for your expertise and for being so generous with your time. I really appreciate it. And I just want to say to the folks who participated, we're going to be sending out resources from each of these organizations. And I know that our panelists are willing to engage with people one-on-one. We'll include their emails. I want to just urge you in terms of kind of center business to make sure you get a listen of the newest episode of the Center's podcast, Speech Matters, talking about Section 203 and the 2 cases on the Supreme Court that could completely change the internet landscape. I think it ties in to a lot of the things that we're talking about, because I think there is also a lot of connection between what happens in technology and on platforms and what's happening within our educational institutions, as Brian was sort of speaking to. And then we're going to drop this year's final episode next month. And in the meantime, I want to wish everybody a warm and healthy Thanksgiving, and we'll see you before the end of the year. Thanks, everyone, again.